Okay, so we're going to be starting on ecology. You guys want me to turn the lights down? Or no, we don't have the center screen, so it's probably fine like this. And then you can see each other in your notes. So we're going to be starting on ecology, and really, I don't know why your book has crammed so many things into so many chapters, and then it gets to ecology and it spreads it out over 3 chapters. So really, this chapter is mostly an introduction to what ecology is and what ecologists do. So we're really entering a different branch of science, a different type of science. So I wanted to start by talking about what ecology is. Ecology is a very broad area of science. It's the study of relationships and interactions between organisms and their environment. So organisms can either interact with other organisms, which are called biotic interactions, or organisms can interact with physical things in their environment, which are called abiotic. So biotic are living organisms, other living organisms, and abiotic are non-living things, so interacting with the environment, interacting with geology, interacting with tides or weather or anything that has to do with an aspect of the environment that's not living, not an organism. So biotic versus abiotic, names you'll hear again as we go over this. So one of the questions most students have when they're thinking about or hear the word ecology is, what's the difference between ecology and environmental science? So we actually have some environmental science classes which you could take. So there's Florida ecosystems class. There's an environmental biology class right now, I think, and we're actually putting together an environmental science class. Environmental science is really an interdisciplinary science. It looks at the environment from many different viewpoints, including natural sciences, and there's definitely a big natural sciences, so biology, chemistry component, but it also looks at it from an engineering and a social science aspect. So things like law, things like public policy. So they don't all only take into account what biologically is most important in the environment, but also how can we accomplish things using the laws and using public policy, advocacy, and things like that. So they use all those fields to study environmental problems, things such as pollution, environmental degradation, biodiversity, sustainability. So it's really focused on the environment, and often the environment from a human perspective, and how to deal with environmental problems using a multidisciplinary approach. Whereas ecology, on the other hand, is the study of relationships and interactions between organisms and their environment. So it's a very strictly biological look at how organisms interact with their environment. So there's definitely a big component of ecology in environmental science. You're going to be looking at these interactions in environmental science, but you're also adding in all this other stuff that is not really biological, that involves a lot of other areas. So that's really the big thing, is that it's almost the difference between like physics and engineering, whereas physics is you're looking at how things interact with physically, how things, when they smash off each other, how they interact. You're looking at mathematical modeling of things. And then engineering is you're taking all that you've known through physics and you're applying it to world problems, like keeping a building standing in the wind or something. It's the same idea where ecology is the science. Environmental science really applies ecology to environmental problems. So very interesting courses if you ever do think about taking them, to take like the Florida ecosystems course or the environmental biology courses. And you'll be actually applying some of the concepts I'm going to be talking about over the next 3 lectures to environmental problems, thinking about that. I also teach an ecology course, but it's a 3,000 level course, so you have to have taken 1010 and 1011 before you take it. So any of you that are going to stick around and go through the sciences, if you really like the next 3 lectures, and you take 10, 10, and 10, 11, come back and take ecology. It's a very exciting course, and you get to do a lot of field work with it. Okay, so because ecology is an incredibly broad topic, really, it's any time you're studying any organism and any interaction that they have with other organisms or with their environment, there's a lot that can be covered in ecology. And we typically break down the fields of ecology, so you can actually take very specific ecology courses. If you went to a big university that had lots and lots of ecology researchers, there might be one that teaches a population ecology course. There might be one that teaches a community ecology course. There might be someone that teaches a marine ecology course, things like that. So we often break down ecology by the scope of the organisms that it looks at. And we're going to kind of go through these different levels today. So organismal is kind of the first level that ecologists might look at, and that is looking at individual adaptations of individual organisms and how those adaptations affect the survival and reproduction of that individual organism. So one particular organism. So above that is the level of population. Populations are groups of one species in one area at one time. And so a population ecology question is going to look at how populations of species grow and interact with each other. So it's looking at interactions within a population, within one species, in one location. You can get a little broader and you can look at community ecology. Community ecology is now going to look at multiple species, so more than one species interacting in one area, and how those species interactions will influence the number of species that can be present in the area, what roles the different species might take on in that area, and different questions like that. And then kind of the broadest one that I'm going to talk about today is ecosystem ecology. And ecosystem ecology now not only takes into account individual organisms, not only individual species, not only multiple species, but also multiple species and the nutrients and energy flow between different communities, within communities, and between communities and their environment. So we're going to be working out a lot more interactions between communities and environmental conditions. So it's kind of the broadest scale. Okay, so I'm going to go through each of these again and kind of show you some questions that you might ask in each of these levels of ecology. All right, so here's the first one. So organismal ecology. You might study how organisms are exposed to environmental changes. And this is one of the big things. So a question might be, how do zebras regulate their internal water balance? So you might be looking at just zebras here and how they regulate their water balance. So questions are, what is it like to live on land? What is it like to live in water? You're asking very specific questions about very specific organisms. This picture on the right, which didn't turn out all that well, is a picture of the intertidal zone. And you can see that there's kind of stripes there. And those stripes are different organisms living at different levels. So down at the bottom, there's a lot of sea anemone. In the middle region, the whitish region, are a lot of mussels and a lot of mussels and other kind of barnacles, gooseneck barnacles probably. Up at the top is more kind of lichens and other kind of crusty organisms, a lot of crustose algae that might grow up there. So there's different layers of these, and a lot of what drives where these organisms live on the rocky intertidal zone here is based on interactions between the organism and their environment. So it's not necessarily organisms interacting with each other, though there is some component to that, and we'll get into it. Their interactions with the environment are a big player of this. So in the intertidal zone, the water goes up and down with the tide. So some organisms can only stand being out of the water for so long. So they're going to be very low down in the intertidal zone. Some organisms can only stand being submerged in water for a short period of time. So they're going to be near the top of the intertidal zone, something that's more exposed. So that's an organismal question, is looking at where is that organism, Why is it there? How does it respond to environmental changes? Okay. So interactions between organisms and between organisms and their environment are often things that drive evolution. So organismal ecology will drive evolution. So we've been looking at some of this stuff, but not really from the ecology perspective, but from the evolution perspective. So whether or not that bird lives or dies and reproduces is going to influence the evolution of its species. So the bird with the long beak that can eat the cactus versus the bird with the short beak that can't eat the cactus, it's that organismal interaction. Can it actually feed and survive? That is determining whether it's going to reproduce, and that drives evolution. So it's often these kind of individual organismal interactions that lead to success or not success of reproduction. So, and evolution will often lead to adaptation to environments. So a better fit ecologically to its environment. So organisms are often found in environments that they can survive. That's kind of silly. They are found in environments they can survive. If they're not in an environment that they can survive in, they're not going to survive. So temperature relations are a big thing. Temperature drives where different species can go. So as temperatures change, distributional patterns will change. And we'll look a little bit at that as we get through the next few chapters. Water relations, so just what I was talking about before with the intertidal zone. So what kind of water can they sustain? Also, can they sustain life in freshwater or saltwater environments? So you'll find certain organisms in freshwater and different ones in saltwater because they can only live in one of those things. Energy relations, so how do they get energy? So you actually won't find green algae very deep in the water because green light does not, because the light that they need to survive doesn't go that deep. You're going to find red algae deeper because green light penetrates further and they're able to absorb that green light. So their relationship with energy will drive their distribution. And then social relations, so how they interact socially with other organisms will also drive organismal ecology. Okay. So the next level up from organismal ecology is population ecology. And a population is, which we've talked about before, but I'll reiterate now, and I'll also talk about it again when we get to the next chapter on Tuesday. A population is a group of interbreeding individuals that occur in the same place at the same time. So because they're interbreeding, it means they're the same species. So they're groups of individuals of the same species in the same place at the same time. So a question a population ecologist might ask is, what factors affect population growth, size, and density? So they might be wondering, in this location, so in this grassland area in Africa, in Kenya, how many zebra can survive here? And why? Why can we have a herd of zebra that has 200 here, but why in the similar sized field, a few hundred miles away, can we only sustain 50 zebra? So they're asking questions like that. What are the factors that are affecting this population size? What is limiting the growth of the population in that second field that is not limiting the growth of the population in this field here? Density, so how closely can these things live? So is there a behavioral change? So some animals will push other members of their population away from them because of territoriality. And maybe the territory zones are different in different populations. And why is that? These are questions that they might ask. All right. So population, again, is a group of interbreeding individuals, so individuals of the same species that are breeding in the same place at the same time. So next level above population ecology is community. So how a community is different than a population is that communities now are looking at all organisms, not just those of an interbreeding species. So you're now looking at the lions and the wildebeest. You're looking at the birds and the giraffe. You're looking at the zebras and the giraffe there. So it's all organisms that inhabit a particular area. So it's populations of several species interacting. And they might ask, how do interactions between species, things like predation, things like competition, things like mutualism, things like parasitism, things we're going to cover in the next chapter, how do these interspecies interactions affect community structure and organization? So how many wildebeest have to be present for the lion to be there, or to scare the lion away or something like that? So what are the interactions between the lion and the wildebeest? Which wildebeest does the lion go for? And how does that affect the rest of the herd? Things like that. What is the relationship between these birds and this giraffe? Are the birds trying to eat the giraffe? Are the birds eating parasites on the giraffe's neck? So is this more a mutualistic relationship? Is there a benefit to the giraffe? Is it all benefit for the birds? Or what is going on there? How are they interacting with each other? And why do we see the things we see like this? So a lot of community ecology questions are really, really interesting like this. So, why do we see these animals together, and why only these? Why can't we have maybe having a lion and wildebeest and having hyenas there might change the dynamics, and what change occurs when you add an extra species there. Okay. And so both population ecology and community ecology are the two chapters we're going to be going into. So we're going to really focus on those in the next few chapters. This chapter, we're really going to be focusing on organismal ecology. We won't really touch too much on the next group, which is ecosystem ecology, all that much in this book, just because we only have a few lectures left. So you can even look more broadly than just at one community, and you can look at ecosystem ecology. An ecosystem is both the living biotic community and the non-living abiotic community. So both the frog and the rain, as well as the plant the frog's on, right? So we're looking at, so those are two organisms, the frog and the plant, and then an abiotic environment like rainfall. So they're asking questions like, how does rainfall and temperature and sunlight affect communities? So and we're going to get into biomes later on, but we might look at how do community structure in the rainforest biome differ from community structure in the desert biome. So we're looking at how those environmental changes, high rainfall versus low rainfall, how does that affect how communities interact with each other? So does this added kind of layer give us more understanding of what's going on between these organisms? So and here's another question down here. How does fire affect nutrient availability in grassland ecosystems? So you'll learn a lot of, actually this is a big thing that happens down here, is that the Everglades are actually a highly fire-dependent environment. So they need to burn every so often to release nutrients, to lower biomass, and to kind of free up space for organisms to regrow in. So because we as humans have stopped a lot of that fire due to building houses, due to draining the Everglades, we've changed the dynamics there. We actually have to do controlled burns often to to actually reduce the risk of large fires and to create a lot of these interactions and benefits to fire that are not occurring naturally anymore. So we highly manage this. And it's only through studying the effect of fire on the Everglades that we know, well, we have to burn them every 3 years or 5 years or something like that. So we have to have these regimes. Okay. So, so those are the different levels of ecology that ecologists might study. We're going to go into a few of them throughout the next few chapters. So this chapter we're going to start looking at kind of organismal level. Really, we're going to be looking at a lot of abiotic factors and how that affects organisms. On Tuesday, we're going to look at population ecology, so we're going to look at how species within one area will interact within their species. And then 2 Tuesdays from now, we're going to look at community ecology, so we're going to look at how different species might interact with each other. So, in order to know how environmental change and environmental conditions affect organisms and lead to, organismal distributions and maybe drive evolutionary processes, we need to know a little bit about how abiotic factors of the Earth come about. And we're going to learn a little bit about the climate and things like that, just to a very, very, very basic extent. I'm not going to go into that much detail. So distribution of living things, of biotic things on Earth, on life on Earth, is really a reflection of the abiotic factors. So factors like energy, so where is the sun, where are the sources of energy, so other sources of energy, so where are the nutrients, where is that all located? Temperature changes, so what temperature is it in what part of the Earth is going to determine what types of organisms can live there. Where is water distributed? So a lot of organisms need to be in or near water. So that's going to influence organisms. And the presence or absence of inorganic nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and other inorganic matter that's going to be necessary for life to exist. Okay, so we really can split up the Earth into regions called biomes. Biomes are terrestrial or aquatic life zones that are characterized by the type of vegetation, which is how we characterize them on land, or the actual physical environment, which is aquatic. And of course, like I was saying in the last slide, the type of vegetation that's present in these different areas of the world is largely dependent on abiotic factors, which we'll talk a little bit more about how they come about later on. So here's 2 aquatic biomes, and I'm going to go into a little more detail of this on the next slide. This is the freshwater biomes and the marine biomes. So this is definitely something, if you were to take marine biology or oceanography, you'd be really focused on learning about these different environments and different zones. There are really a lot of marine environments are categorized by their physical environment, so how deep the water is, as well as where the light zone is. So a marine biome has really 3 major zones to it. It's got a photic zone, which is where light is available for photosynthesis. And it tends to be a pretty narrow region, so very near the surface. So in a freshwater area, a freshwater kind of lake, it's pretty constant where that photic zone is. It's near the surface. It's as far as the light will penetrate. In a marine environment, so an ocean environment, that zone actually has a little bit of variability. Between where the tides are is something called the intertidal zone. I know it's very small on this, but it is a graphic out of your book. There's an intertidal zone, and there's different kind of stresses that go that play a role in the intertidal zone because organisms are exposed to land for part of their life, and they're underwater for other parts of their life. But then there's a region that is constantly submerged but also has light, and that's called the photic zone. Anything below the level that light penetrates is called an aphotic zone, and there's not enough light for photosynthesis, so you're not going to find aquatic plants there. So there are other organisms that will live in the aphotic zone. Lots of animals, lots of filter feeders such as sponges and things like that. There are sea pens. But there's not much in the way of food. Most of the food in the aphotic zone actually comes down from the photic zone. So it's things that have settled out of the photic zone and kind of fall into the aphotic zone. So a lot of the organisms that live deep in the water either are scavengers, they'll feed on whatever's falling down on them, or they're things like whales and octopus that can actually go up and down. And they'll go up and they'll feed, and then they'll go back down where they're a little more protected. They might be further away from predators, so things like that. So the relationship between where the food is and where they might want to feel safe is based on depth, is based on where the light is. So algae, things that I study, would all be found in the photic zone, because outside of that, they're not going to survive. And they provide a fuel source for a lot of things living in the photic zone. So again, then the third one is the intertidal zone. This is areas that are underwater at high tide and exposed at low tide. And there's a lot of really interesting interactions that go on there because it's a very high stress environment. And not only will you see organisms stratified, sort of spread out based on the depth that they're at, but you also see them competing with each other. They're actually will get eaten if they're too high, and they'll often, or I guess they'll get eaten if they're too low in the water, and they'll dry out if they're too high. So there's a lot of things constraining things in the intertidal zone. Okay, so that's what happens in marine land. They're not stressed out based on water, because there's usually a fair amount of water availability unless they're in the intertidal zone. One of the major things that drives location of organisms is how deep they are. So how far away they are from the photic zone. Okay. Terrestrial biomes, so earth, land biomes, are largely determined by climate. This climate will determine what types of organisms can be present in them. And climate has a lot to do with the curvature of the Earth, the rotation of the Earth, and the sunlight hitting the Earth. So because the Earth is round, because it's curved, solar radiation does not hit everywhere on Earth equally. So at the equator, so at 0 degrees, right at the widest part of the Earth, sunlight hits the Earth most directly. So this is where light rays coming from the sun hit it pretty much direct on. At the poles, sunlight actually hits the Earth at an angle. And if you think about the atmosphere, you think about the Earth here, and you've got the sun that's actually much bigger than this, but light rays hit it directly, and they go right through to the Earth, versus light rays hitting at an angle to the Earth. They actually have to travel through a lot more atmosphere before they get to the Earth. And as a result, the intensity of solar radiation is less at the poles than it is at the equator. So light at the equator is more intense. There's more energy hitting the equator than there is hitting the poles. Okay. And what this does is it causes the air and land at the pole, or at the equator, to heat up at a much faster rate than air at the poles, which you probably are not surprised at. You go further south near the equator, for us northern hemisphere people, and temperature gets warmer in general. Pretty nice climate. Yes, it's really cold this week, but probably right now, since it's warmed up a little bit, you're going outside without a jacket. If you were up in New York where they've had many feet of snow, you would not be outside without being bundled up, right? So it's not all that far, but it's further away from the equator, so temperatures are a little colder. There's less solar radiation there. So what this does is when this warm air hits land at the equator, it warms up the air, and warm air rises. So warm air will tend to rise. So if you I don't know, a lot of houses down here don't have it, but if you have an attic, your attic is insanely hot probably, whereas your first floor is probably pretty nice and cool. If you have AC, if you have a 2-floor house and you have AC, your air conditioning is constantly going down to the first floor, right? So most people have 2 systems if they have 2 floors. So warm air will rise. As warm air rises, it releases moisture. So it tends to rain a fair amount near the equator. As it moves up, then the air will actually start moving away from the equator, because as air cools, it's going to be kind of descending, and it will actually soak up water. So you get what's called, you get these cells, basically, where air is rising here because it's being warm. It's then moving north and moving south from the equator, where it cools at high atmospheres and descends. And the reason why it's moving like this is that as air moves away from the equator, something has to take its place. So it's air coming from the north and south. So you tend to have these cells where you have low altitude winds headed down to the equator or headed up to the equator, high altitude winds going away from the equator. You get, right here at the equator, an area where it's dumping a lot of moisture, so it's very wet. And then here, as air cools and descends, it's actually going to pull up moisture. So you get a very dry zone here and a dry zone here. Okay, so we get areas in the Earth that we call the tropics, where there's a lot of rainfall. And then we get areas outside the tropics, which we call the temperate zone. And right at that kind of border between the tropics and the temperate zone, we get a very dry zone. And I'm going to show you a map of the Earth, hopefully, in a little bit. And where do you think you find a lot of deserts on Earth? So yeah, so right at that border where this air is descending and pulling up all the moisture. So we're going to see that there's actually a band of deserts in the north and a band of desert zones in the southern hemisphere, and they pretty much line up right with this kind of 30-degree north, 30-degree south zone. We actually are pretty much right in a desert zone, but Florida has a very odd environment because we are kind of an island here. We've got Lake Okeechobee, we've got the Gulf, we've got the Atlantic. We're pretty much surrounded by water. So we get some really weird things, especially in the summer, where in the summer, heat of the day starts coming down, that starts warming up the Earth, and once it gets warm enough, the air all starts rising, and right about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, boom, we get a thunderstorm, right? Because that warm air that's been building throughout the day because of the sun has been going north, or going up into the atmosphere, and it's going to start dumping all that water. And as it's going north, it's actually moving, and the friction of movement is what leads to thunderstorms. So we have this very kind of, on a small scale, this is happening over Florida during the summer. And we get tons of thunderstorms due to that because of the heating throughout the day. Yeah. Okay, so this is what's going to determine a lot of where things are, and I'm going to show you some more things as we go forward here. You know, I don't have a slide on this, but I think it's a really cool thing. So the Earth is spinning. Right? So the Earth is spinning, and it spins clockwise here. And as it spins, because the equator, it's fatter at the equator than it is up here, at more near the poles. If you're standing on Earth and you are measuring how fast you're moving in relation to the spinning of the Earth, in relation to space, at the equator, you're moving a little faster than you are up here, because spinning basically on this axis. So if you were right up here at the top, the North Pole, basically, you wouldn't be moving at all. You're basically rotating like this, so you're not moving all that fast. But down here in the equator, you're spinning really, really rapidly. So if we think about these winds that are moving south in the northern hemisphere on the surface, they're moving from an area that's moving pretty slow to an area that's moving pretty fast. So because of this, the Earth is actually, as they move, the Earth is turning underneath of them. And so if we look at this from a stationary perspective, it looks like the winds are going that way. And so winds at the equator, on the northern side of the equator, tend to go from east to west. Though if you go up near the temperate zone, where those winds are actually headed north, winds will actually go the other direction. They're going from here, where it's moving pretty fast, and they're headed north to an area that's going slower, so they actually look like they're deflected this way. So if you've ever wondered why storms in North America tend to go from the western to the eastern side, is because we are north of the tropics in an area where the winds are headed north, and because of the spin of the Earth, they actually head east. So winds will head east, north of the tropics. In the tropics, winds tend to head west until you get south of the equator, and then everything's reversed the other way around. So, that's pretty cool, I think. But if you understood what I was saying, that's why we get the winds in the directions we do. And that's why it's pretty constant that we're getting winds. Florida, again, weird environment, and we get winds that seem to change all the time, but that's mostly because we are an island and there's a lot of effect of water around you that changes these things. So we can get storms that seem to pop out of nowhere. All right, some other things that affect climate are elevation. So mountains affect climate in two ways. One, as elevation increases, temperature drops. And the reason for this is pressure and molecules. So if we remember back to when we were talking about chemistry, we were talking about heat. Heat is the random movement of molecules. And when sunlight comes through the atmosphere and hits the Earth, it causes molecules to start moving. At lower elevations, so down near where we are, near sea level, there's a lot of pressure. And so air molecules are pretty compact. So when energy hits those air molecules, it can get them moving pretty rapidly relative to each other. The higher up in elevation you go, the less pressure there is, so the less densely packed air molecules are. So one thing, this will make it hard for you to breathe at higher altitudes. So this is why if you were to go out to Colorado and go hike a mountain right now, you'd probably be pretty out of breath. But someone that lives in Colorado comes down here, they're going to feel really, really good because they're well adapted to that low oxygen, lower pressure environment. After 2 weeks there, you'd feel much better. You would acclimate to it. But because molecules are far apart, when sunlight hits them, it takes more energy to get them moving. So temperatures tend to be lower at higher elevations. So we're going to see differences in vegetation even in at the same latitude based on elevation. This is why if you go to mountains in West Virginia and you look at the organisms living there, they actually look pretty similar to organisms living in New Brunswick, Canada, which is much, much further north, but a much lower elevation. So you have an area in West Virginia, high elevation, then you have an area in Canada with a low elevation. They have very similar organisms because being at high altitude makes you look more like things being at a more northern climate. The second thing that mountains do is that they tend to have different climates on the different sides of them. So those winds that are ripping across because of the spinning of the Earth and because of these cells that are created by unequal heating of the Earth, as those winds hit a mountain, they are pushed up the mountain because there's really nowhere for them to go but up. And as they go up the mountain, just like warm air rising, they're going to dump their water. So any moisture that's in the air, as it goes up the mountain, it drops its water. So once the winds get to the other side of the mountain, there's no water left in them. So you get what's called a rain shadow. And so here's coastal mountains in the west. You have the Sierra Nevada mountains. One side of them, very, very wet. So you look at California, you look at the coastal area where most of the people are. Very, very wet, really lush environment. This is where we get lots of our food from because there's lots of farms there growing lots of food all year round. It's a very nice environment. You go to the other side of the Sierra Nevadas, the other side of the Rocky Mountains, and we have deserts because of the rain shadow effect of the mountain. So the mountain makes the water all drop on one side, and then the other side tends to be much drier. Okay. So mountains affect climate, so does unequal heating of the earth affects climate. Okay. So what does this lead to? Well, because of all these different interactions and all these different parts of the world, we get what we call terrestrial biomes. And we actually categorize these things largely by two factors, temperature and precipitation. So how warm or how cold is it? And usually the kind of mean temperature, so on average what it is. But we also take into effect the extremes. And how much rain does it get throughout the year? Because these two things, more than anything else, will have an effect on vegetation type. So the types of plants and animal, or the types of plants that'll be there, and that'll drive the types of animals that'll be there. So your book goes through all these different biomes. So tropical forest, desert, temperate grasslands, temperate broadleaf forest, and all these different things. By no means do I expect you to remember all of them and to remember the differences specifically, like amount of rainfall and things. So I'm going to go through a few of these, but this is not a sign that I think you need to memorize all these. If you were taking an ecology course, you might learn more about these biomes and learn more about some of the specifics of what makes them up. But really, I just want to highlight some of the differences between these different environments. All right. So tropical forests tend to be equatorial. So as I said, at the equator, you get a ton of rainfall because of the high amount of solar energy that's hitting there. They tend to also be very warm. So you get warm, equatorial, and you also get a ton of rainfall. So 200 to 400 centimeters per year is a lot of rainfall. And that's what these tropical forests have. So if you look at the graph on the upper right, it shows temperature range is pretty high up, and so is precipitation. So if you look at the map there, you'll notice that tropical forests, tropical rainforests, run in a band right around the equator. You get some in South America, you get some in Central Africa, you get some in Northern Australia, you get some in Southern Asia. So there's tropical forests right at the equator, because that's where you get lots of rainfall and you get lots of energy, so very, very warm temperatures. Okay. If we go just north and just south of the tropical rainforest zone, we get deserts. So deserts are mainly found just north and just south of the tropics. This is the area where this weather cell has winds descending, so air is descending, and so it is actually pulling out moisture. It's very dry air. Deserts can be extreme in temperatures. We have very, very hot deserts, but we also have very, very cold deserts. And a lot of this has to do with the type of vegetation that's found there. The vegetation that's in deserts often does not maintain a lot of heat. So when the sun is on them during the day, they can get very, very hot. But at night, very little heat is retained in the vegetation and in the soil, so it becomes very, very cold. So they'll have very cold nights, very hot days often. There's also very low rainfall due to the locations. And if you look at where they are, because of the lack of land in the southern hemisphere, we only really see big deserts in Australia there. but kind of central Australia. But we'll see northern Africa as well as kind of right where we are, but west of us in the US. So again, Florida, if we were part of a giant landmass, where we are in Florida would probably be desert. But because of other factors like all the water that's around us, we have a different climate. So yes, it's pretty dry during the winter, but during the summer, because of the way things play out and all the water that our environment can draw from, we get rains in the summer, which we wouldn't if we were, smack in the middle of Africa at the same region. Okay, so desert have low rainfall and extremes of temperatures. Okay. Kind of inland in the U.S. and in Europe and Asia is an area called temperate grasslands. Temperate grasslands are mostly treeless, and this is pretty much a factor that they don't have a terribly great amount of rain. They have frequent droughts, and because of the frequent droughts, they have frequent fires. And so with lots of fire, it's very hard for trees, so larger plant species, to take hold. So some of them, if you prevent fires from being in these zones, trees might start to grow there. And if we irrigate, we might get lots of land like this. But they tend to be pretty treeless and mostly just through grass. They're great for grazers like this. Picture shows, but they tend to be these long kind of flat areas full of grasslands. Yeah. So low rainfall, still pretty warm, and they're really fire dependent. Kind of to the east of those grasslands in North America, so what's pretty much the whole east coast except for Florida, as well as large parts of Europe and kind of coastal Asia there, are what are called temperate broadleaf forests. These have a fair amount of moisture. So now they're still in a similar temperature range to those grasslands, but they have enough moisture now to support larger trees. So their rainfall is 75 to 150, or a little bit higher. You'll see a lot of deciduous trees in this environment because they are far enough north, far enough away from the equator to get large temperature fluctuations. So they get warm summers, very cold winters. So the trees will go dormant during the winter, and they'll actually drop their leaves, which is what deciduous trees are. This is where you'll see the great color changes up north. So a lot of what we know of kind of the northeast U.S. are temperate broadleaf forests. And the reason why we have trees there is that there's more rain, so there's less fire, and there's enough rainfall to support these larger organisms like trees. If you go further north, kind of at the same region but further north, you go up into Canada and northern U.S., so Maine and Vermont, you're now going to get to a region that is too cold for broadleaf trees. So broadleaf trees do really well because during the summer months it's nice and warm, they can grow, they can really flourish in the summer, and then they just go dormant during the winter. If you get further north, the summer weather becomes shorter and shorter in the year, and at a certain point, broadleaf trees cannot survive the whole winter. So you start to get what's called a coniferous forest, not carnivorous, coniferous forest. So this is dominated by cone-bearing evergreen trees. So these would be your pine trees, things like that have the really small, fine needles. They're evergreen, which means they don't drop their leaves in the winter. So they have specially adapted leaves that allow them to survive the winter conditions, which means they can photosynthesize year-round. They don't go dormant completely in the winter. There's kind of a large range of rainfall in these zones, from 50 to 250. So they get rainfall even up into the range near the tropical forest. You'll actually get tropical, you'll get rainforest, you'll get coniferous rainforest, basically, in the western coast of Canada. We'll see that. The northern coniferous forest is called the taiga, but this kind of ranges mostly in Canada, some northern U.S. states, and it's also all throughout northern Europe we get these kinds of things. So again, too cold for the broadleaf trees, so we have a different type of tree that flourishes there. Even further north of the coniferous forest is an area called the tundra. And now we are too far north for large trees to grow. The ground has what's called permafrost, which means that it's permanently frozen subsoil. So basically you have a small region of soil that you can dig into, but below that it's frozen, and it's frozen year-round. There's very low rainfall generally in this region, so we get, like we have cells here, we get another cell here, and we're now up in this region where you're getting another kind of desert-like environment. We get very kind of lower rainfall. And because of the lack of trees and the lack of a lot of large organisms, winds just rip through this environment, so we get very high winds and pretty cold temperatures. So most of the vegetation is very, very low to the ground to stay out of those high winds, and grows very, very slowly because winters are really long, summers are incredibly short. They might get 1, maybe 2 months of kind of summer-like weather, but the rest of the year is pretty cold and pretty windy. So you don't get those forests anymore. Okay, so those are just an example. There's other things that your book goes into, other environments. This is just an example of some of the ones you might be familiar with and what you might not be familiar with. And trying to follow kind of a progression further north to see that we get tropical rainforests here, we get deserts in this zone. In this zone, depending on the water level, which is often due to presence of mountains, we get grasslands where there's low amounts of rain. We get broadleaf forests where there's high amounts of rain. When we get further north into areas where it's too cold for broadleaf trees, we get cone-bearing trees, we get evergreen trees, and some of these regions are going to have high rain, so we're going to get rainforest-like environments, but it's temperate, so we get temperate rainforest. It's still cold, but there's a lot of rain. And then we get areas even further north where it's dry again, and we lose our trees again because it's too dry and too cold. Okay, so now that we know that temperature, rainfall varies dramatically throughout the Earth, what effect does this have on organisms? Well, as we've already seen in those examples, it limits organismal distribution. So temperature drastically limits organisms based on metabolism. So if you think about the reactions of metabolism, so photosynthesis, cellular respiration, all of those require enzymes. And we've talked about enzymatic reactions requiring, any reaction really requiring heat to get that reaction going. So metabolism requires organisms to maintain certain body temperatures. Most organisms can't function at body temperatures below 0 degrees Celsius, so freezing, so 32 Fahrenheit. So below 32 Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius, most organisms cannot have the reactions that need to go on inside of their body occur. Same as above 45 degrees Celsius. So this is 120, I believe, 120 degrees Fahrenheit, about around there. So much above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, enzymes start denaturing and reactions again come to a halt. So organisms need to come up with ways to regulate temperature. So this organism here, which is a mammal, generates heat, has a fur coat, and is able to keep its body temperature in that happy range, even if its environment is not. So what do we do? What are you doing when you went outside this morning? What did you probably all do? You shivered, so there's a response that's using muscle movement to generate heat. You put on a coat. Maybe you even tried to figure out how to turn on the heat in your house and remind yourself how to do that, right? which I still haven't figured out. I'm pretty sure we have a heater in there, but I don't know how to use it. So you do something like that, and you try to maintain body temperature, because if you get too cold, it's not going to happen. The other extreme, which we experience all the time, is higher temperatures. You go in a place that has air conditioning. You turn on a fan. You sweat. You go swimming. You do something like that to lower your body temperature to keep you at an ideal temperature. And most mammals do this. A lot of other organisms do this as well. They try to maintain that temperature. And different organisms have different strategies. And this is why you'll see fewer organisms at the extremes, so in extreme heat or extreme, so in the deserts where it's extremely hot and dry, and in the tundra where it's extremely cold and dry. You're not going to see as many organisms because it takes more adaptations to be able to survive in those environments. Species are also limited based on their water availability. So terrestrial organisms, so organisms on land, have to make sure that they don't dry out. So lizards have tough, thick skin. Plants have waxy coatings on their leaves to prevent losing water moisture. Aquatic organisms have to deal with osmotic pressure, so deal with salt water, deal with fresh water. They have to make sure that they don't lose or gain too much water. So there's a lot of these things that ecologists will study, is how does an organism deal with water change, deal with temperature change. So when organisms go from one environment to another, they need to be able to adjust. And kind of gradual adjustment to environmental change is called acclimation. It's gradual physiological adjustments in response to environment change. So one example is increase in red blood cells in response to altitude. So if you go from here, where we're basically at sea level, and you go to Colorado, you go hike a mountain in Colorado where you're at a high altitude, you're going to feel pretty crummy at first. You're not going to be able to walk very far. You're not going to feel all that energetic. You stay there for about 2 weeks or so, and you're going to start feeling better. And the reason for that is your body senses that oxygen levels are lower, that you're having to pump your heart a lot more and breathe a lot more to get enough oxygen to your muscles to do cellular respiration. So what happens is your body starts producing more red blood cells. And so you fill up your bloodstream with red blood cells. So this is an acclimation to that altitude. If you come back to Florida, you're going to have, for a very brief time, feel like superhuman because you have so much red blood cells that you're pumping around that you're going to feel very energized. But over time, your body's going to lower that down because there's downsides to having extra red blood cells. More likely to have clot problems, takes more energy to keep those red blood cells moving, so you're going to start losing them eventually. So acclimation, physiological acclimation, generally limited to the range of environmental conditions a species naturally experiences. So if we all of a sudden went to the top of Mount Everest, we might not be able to acclimate to that drastic of a change. And this is why a lot of hikers to Mount Everest bring oxygen with them. So they try to increase the amount of oxygen in their environment. This is why really, really insane skydivers that go really high up in altitude have to take oxygen as well, because you're not going to be able to acclimate to that kind of condition. So physiological adaptations, usually short-term changes in response to environments, allowing them to live pretty well within a range of conditions. Other things organisms might do is there might be anatomical adaptations to environmental change. So could be changes in body shape or structure that can be reversible. So here's one example is the Arctic fox. Arctic fox actually have two different hair colors. In the winter, they're going to be white. In the summer, they're black. So they'll actually regrow fur of a different color seasonally. And the reason for this, the reason this is successful is that in the winter it tends to be covered in snow up in the Arctic, and in the summer there's no snow, so they would stick out. If they were white year-round, they would stick out in the summer. If they were black year-round, they would stick out in the winter. And it's actually you can actually catch them in the middle of this. Sometimes some will change too early, and they'll be white, and it'll still be summer, or they'll change too late, and they'll still be black in the winter. So optimal time of changing is also adaptive to them. There's also some more permanent changes. You look at Arctic trees, so the trees that do manage to grow up north, they tend to do what's called flagging. And this also happens at high altitudes, where you'll see all the limbs on one side of the tree, and this is a response to wind. So there's so much wind blowing on the tree that they just begin to grow with only limbs on one side, and that way that they're not constantly battling against the wind to stay upright. So like a flag flies in one direction, the tree kind of does that as well. So it's called flagging in trees. This is not something that changes throughout the day. So physiological, anatomical changes. Kind of the last kind of change that organisms can do in response to environmental change are behavioral, and these are some of the things we talked about already. You can migrate, so birds often do this. They head south for the winter. They get away from the temperature change by constantly moving into environments that actually have a pretty similar temperature as to what they were in. A lot of cold-blooded animals, like reptiles, will move between shade and sun. So when they get too hot, they'll move into a shaded area. You might do that as well. You might put up an umbrella and hang out in the shade. When you get too cold, you'll go and lie in the sun. The same thing that a lizard might do. And in humans, we change our clothing. So we're bundled up in the winter. We put on shorts and a t-shirt in the summer, and we change that to maintain temperature. Okay. So kind of to summarize, species distribution is limited based on abiotic factors such as temperature, such as rainfall. So this will limit the distribution of organisms, although adaptations can allow organisms to expand the range that they inhabit, but only slightly. So you can live a little bit outside of your range. So this is a graph of number of lizard species, and you look that in